y'all. Welcome to Killer Queens, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, Tyrella, and like most millennials, I've always had an obsession with true crime. On KQ, you'll find light true crime stories, millennial hypes and gripes, some adult language, and maybe a special guest here and there. Just like a 90s sleepover, we're just a couple BFFs hanging out. So gather round and let's launch right into it. This episode contains discussion of murder, murder for hire, kidnapping, and mention of torture. Listener discretion is advised. In the 1980s, NYPD detectives Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa secretly worked for the Mafia while on the force, betraying their badge in exchange for cash. Known as the Mafia Cops, they fed mobsters, confidential police information, carried out hits, and even kidnapped targets for crime bosses. Their actions helped fuel organized crime during the New York's most chaotic era. For years, their crimes went unnoticed until a string of investigations and key testimonies exposed them. Their story remains a chilling reminder of corruption at its worst. These guys are douchebags. Like, super douchebags, okay? Also, big hey girl thanks to Mark for requesting this and writing this up. He watched the Vice show Betraying the Badge, and he said, you know what? I'm going to do this one. And so here we are. Thanks, Mark. So today's episode is going to take us to New York City, and we're going to talk about two NYPD detectives, Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa. And while their story might sound like something from a C-list Hollywood movie, it really happened, and many lives were lost because of them and their douchebaggery. In the mid-1980s in New York, the city was at a low point. The crime rate was off the charts, and the police were barely able to keep up with any of it. And people who lived there called it Fear City. And I actually think there's a documentary called Fear City. Now, this isn't the touristy parts of the city, but where, working class people, everyday people were living day in, day out. At the time, with all the crime, there were people behind the scenes pulling the strings on quite a bit of what was going on in these neighborhoods, spread out all across the city, and that is the Mafia. There were 5 major crime families at the time, all trying to prove that they're the top dog, right? Because God forbid, we don't have the biggest dick in New York City. We have the Gambino family, the Lucchese family, the Colombo family, the Genovese family, and the Bonanno family. And it's said that you pretty much couldn't name a type of criminal activity in New York at the time that could not be traced back to one of those families, okay? / organizations, because these are not just like, oh, here's mom, dad, and the 2 kids. Like, these are like, the family, that kind of like the scary family. Not the Olive Garden family. When you hear your family, not that kind of family, okay? There's different kinds of family. This is the family, So nightly, the news reported on robberies, murders, and everything in between, all attributed to the mob. Many news outlets were very careful not to mention any specific family, or they might have the wrath of that family raining down on them. Yikes. The crime rate was so high and the families had so much power that the NYPD was struggling to recruit new officers or even keep the officers they already had. They were desperate for new recruits, particularly the kind of officers who knew how to handle themselves if a physical altercation were to occur. One of those officers that they did have who stayed on the force was Louis, who went by Lou Eppolito. He was recruited to the NYPD in 1969, something that pretty much everyone who knew him was a little shooketh about. His mother, Teresa, worked as a registered nurse, and Eppolito's father, Ralph, was a hard-nosed, tough guy who didn't stand for disrespect of him or his family. And while that might seem typical of men of that time and area, Ralph and his family were a little bit different. Ralph was known as, quote, Fat the Gangster, and he was an associate of the Gambino crime family. Lou had an uncle and cousin, James and James Jr., who were both made men in the Gambino crime family. I'm thinking of Joe Jr. from While You Were Sleeping. Is this man bothering you? It was leaning, that, like James and James Jr., So I obviously am from Tennessee and not New York. So that's as good as I can get there. And that movie was set in Chicago. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Now, a brief side tour to talk about what it means to become made in the mob. It wasn't something that just anyone who worked with the families could do. For many people, it was absolutely impossible and they would forever be an associate. It's like selling LuLaRoe leggings, okay? You're never going to be the one that gets to go on the cruise. They tell you you could be the one that goes on the cruise. You're not going on the cruise. You're never going to sell enough to go on the cruise. It's not about selling stuff. So that, it's like that. If you need like a, not even modern day comparison, like a suburban mom comparison, it's like, it's like an MLM. It's never going to happen for you. Stop trying to make it happen, So, to become maid, it used to require that the person have 100% Italian or Sicilian heritage, but in later years, that requirement was loosened up a bit. But another maid man did have to vouch for anyone trying to join the family, and they had to take an oath or a code of silence and honor. I think we have to use the term honor loosely here, guys, but you know what? That's the word they used. Oftentimes to prove loyalty, which I think that's the word we should use. Like they wanted absolute loyalty, but like, guys, honor has a whole different meaning, but okay. Prospective inductees would have to carry out a hit on someone. No big deal. Standard stuff, standard operating procedure. You will have to take out a hit, okay? Or carry out a hit. And then after becoming maid, these members are no longer referred to as associates, but are soldiers for the family. And the only way to work your way up the ladder was to become a soldier, then prove your worth by earning money, of which a percentage was kicked back to the family. Of course, becoming maid came with one big perk. You were untouchable, and the families respected these designations out of fear of starting an all-out street war amongst themselves. To kill a maid man or even strike a maid man was typically punished by death. My God. Guys, are we like, I'm sorry. This feels very like, I'm driving a big truck. Like, it's just, seriously? Okay, so the only real ways for a maid man to be killed was if he was found to be an informant or just have fallen out of favor with the family itself. You do not want to be a rat, right? Word had to come from the head of the family, though, to take out another maid man. You couldn't just be like, hey, he's doing some shady shit. Like, the head of the family had to okay it. So that's what happened with Louis Eppolito's uncle and cousin. Then Gambino crime boss Paul Castellano sanctioned the hit on them. And growing up, Louis's father was 100% against cops and law enforcement of any kind, which would not be a surprise given his association with the Gambino family. After his uncle and cousin were killed, Louis wasn't sure what to do with his life or where to go in life. So his mother suggested, why don't you go and take the test and see if you can become a cop? She said, it's a steady city job. It's got great benefits. Doesn't hurt to just see if you can pass the test, right? Like, no harm, no foul. It's not like it's your live stream. Like, just go check it out. So he lied about his familial associations with the mafia and he passed the test. Now, I have some questions for the NYPD. Isn't your whole entire fucking job to investigate and shit and like, I guess protect and serve, but whatever. If somebody tells you, I don't know anybody in the mob, I have no associations with, and his dad is known around town as Fat the Gangster, his uncle and cousin were literally murdered by the mob. They had a hit taken out on them, which also, like, what did they do? But you guys couldn't sniff that out? We couldn't figure that one out? Come on, guys. Well, anyway, he lied about it and they were like, he didn't say yes, so obviously he's telling the truth. So he passed the test. As a rookie in the police academy, Louis trained next to Stephen Caracappa, who was from Staten Island. In his teenage years, Caracappa had been arrested here and there for burglary, but later he joined the army and then he joined the police force. Eppolito and Caracappa graduated from the academy later in 1969, and then they went their separate ways to where they had each been assigned. Caracappa had become part of the narcotics squad. Eppolito was a beat cop. He worked in Brooklyn. He was actually in the heart of an area where organized crime was heavy, which was fine with him. He didn't want to be sat behind a desk all day. He wanted to be out in the community. He was well-liked. He wasn't afraid to take on any task put in front of him. He was also an avid bodybuilder, so he had this like big, intimidating presence. He was a big guy. 10 years passed, and Eppolito and Caracappa both went on with their careers, and by this time, they were each detectives, and then they were assigned to be partners. You talk about like twin flames gone wrong, or, like you could put this on an episode of Killer Couples, I wonder if they each would have done what they did had they not paired up together. I don't know. Maybe so. They were almost polar opposites from each other. Caracappa had a nickname of the Undertaker because of his appearance and his preference to stay inside at the precinct. He really looked, man, you got to look him up. He had a look about him. I'll tell you that. It's kind of funny. Like, because when you hear the Undertaker, you're thinking like, oh, because he's tough or like this or that. And they're like, no, he doesn't like the sun. And he doesn't really like the outside. And he in daytime, not friends. So he was quiet. He kept to himself more often than not. Eppolito, though, wanted to be out, pounding the pavement. He wanted to be among the citizens. He was also a very loud, boisterous guy. You knew when he was around. But Caracappa was also part of a joint NYPD and federal task force that investigated large, major crime cases like, the mafia. This gave him access to a treasure trove of information that the NYPD had about organized crime at the time. But their partnership officially only lasted for a year before they were each sent to different precincts again. In 1984, the FBI raided the home of a mob lieutenant, Rosario Gambino. What they found brought Eppolito and Caracappa under the microscope, and questions started to circulate about whether they had been providing the mob with internal secrets in exchange for money. So they found police reports from the 63rd precinct in Gambino's house, which just happened to be where Eppolito was working. And they had his fingerprints all over them. And not like, he's in the 63rd precinct and, he might be, no, like his actual fingerprints. Mr. Eppolito, sir, I know it's the 80s, but girl, you know about fingerprints already. You do. You know about them. And honestly, if anybody knows about them, it should be you. You're a detective. Like, pay attention. So Eppolito was suspended pending an investigation, and he said that he handled all kinds of information at work, and his fingerprints could be on just about anything, right? He was brought before an internal investigation board and was acquitted of providing the information to an organized crime family. He was fully reinstated to his position. Of course he was, because the internal people were like, nah, they can do that. Like, okay. Eppolito's son says after this, he could see a definite change in his father. He said, he was still doing his job, but his heart wasn't in it like it was before. He had a lot of angst and anger about it. Like I could see if you've been falsely accused of doing something pretty terrible like that, it's like police officers are supposed to take an oath, prosecutors, all of these people, doctors, like, you take an oath to actually help the people you're supposed to be helping. And so if you're accused of doing the opposite of that, it's like, well, that kind of fucking sucks, right? So I could see being upset about being falsely accused. Key word here, though, falsely, so oops, but, By 1986, the FBI began to crack down on the mafia, and the families began to turn on each other. The Gambino and Lucchese families were at war with one another. Anthony Casso was a member of the Lucchese family, and he had a hit put on him. He was in a car one day when another car pulled alongside and opened fire. He managed to escape from the car and into a nearby building and called his associates to get him. He survived the attack, but he was fucking pissed and hell-bent on revenge, which led him to Bert Kaplan, which, understandable. Somebody tried to kill you and you'd be like, are you fucking kidding me? Obviously, he's put hits out on other people too. So it's a vicious cycle. So Bert Kaplan was a marijuana dealer, but like on a very, very large scale, like by the ton large. Okay. He was not, the guy on the corner or whatever being like, hey man, you want to buy some weed? Like he's He's the big guns, okay? He was an associate of the family, and he told Casso that he might know someone who could get them information regarding who the police suspected in the shooting. And that led them to Frank Santoro, which is a cousin of Louis Eppolito. Eppolito gave Santoro the information they had. He gives it back to Casso and Kaplan, and he said they suspected that it was Eddie, Lino, Jimmy Hidell, and Nicky Guido, all members of the Gambino family. Lino was a high-ranking member who gave the okay to hit Casso. Eddie Lino was shot several times and killed while his car was parked on the side of the road. Jimmy Hidell later disappeared. He was never heard from again. Casso later dispatched some of his soldiers to take care of Nicky Guido. It was Christmas Day. Nick was showing his uncle a new car he had just gotten. A car drove by, opened fire. They kill Nicky Guido. The problem is, this isn't even the right Nicky Guido. It was an innocent man who happened to have the same damn name. Okay, listen here. Again, I am a bumpkin from Tennessee. But I feel like in this community, Nicky Guido might be a semi-common name. Like, do your research. My God. Time passed, and while Caracappa and Eppolito were initially under suspicion, that slowly faded, and eventually they had put in their time. They retired from the NYPD, so Eppolito retires in 1990, Caracappa in 1992. And then Eppolito moves to Las Vegas. He wanted to wash his hands of the NYPD, so he completely changed scenery. His son said that he had a big, beautiful home, but he was really confused about, like, how is he affording this on a cop's pension? You know, like, doesn't really make any sense, but you know what? I don't know. Maybe he's got some other side business or something. I don't know. He didn't ask questions. He was like, I was suspicious, but I didn't ask. When Caracappa retired 2 years after Eppolito, he also moved to Vegas, and he moved across the street from Eppolito. While Caracappa was content to just live his life quietly off anybody's radar, Eppolito wanted more. He wanted to write movie scripts, and he wanted to act. And he actually got a role in Goodfellas, like just a quick passing cameo. He also wrote a book called Mafia Cop. That's like when OJ wrote If I Did It. I mean, my God. In the book, he says he had to overcome the stigma of the mafia while being an officer in the NYPD. In 1992, Eppolito went on the Sally Jesse Raphael show to promote the book. Okay, I just had like saying Sally Jesse Raphael. This is like totally off subject, but like saying it out loud just reminded me of something that I used to say to Jesse, and I haven't said it in so long. But like, you know, when you hear something, you're like, oh my gosh, I remember that now. So obviously Sally Jesse Raphael was like, if you were a 90s kid, you knew her ass and her red glasses, like always. And she was always on in the afternoons, like when you got home from school or whatever. Well, at one point, I don't remember what happened, you know, something. And so I'm telling Jesse, like, sorry, you know, he couldn't have something he wanted to have or something like that. So I said, sorry, Jesse, but that made me think of this. And so then I started saying, sorry, Jesse Raphael. And he would be like, that's not my name. Like, whatever. But I thought it was really funny. And obviously he didn't get it. And saying Sally Jesse Raphael just reminded me of that. So there you have it. Steve, you could say that to your son. He has a Jesse too. Sorry, Jesse Raphael. Okay. So anyway, he goes on her show to promote his book. He didn't know that 2,200 miles away, somebody would see that and make a connection that would take down him and his partner. Betty Hidell, the mother of Jimmy Hidell, who had gone missing after the Anthony Casso hit, remember, saw that show and she immediately recognized Eppolito. She said that many years earlier, he and another man had come to their house looking for Jimmy right around the time that Jimmy disappeared. She went out and bought a copy of Mafia Cop, and as she looked through it, there was a photo of Caracappa, and she recognized that was the other man who had come to her house that day. She called the NYPD cold case unit and gave them the names, saying, look, they might be involved in Jimmy's case. So this started an investigation into the two men by the NYPD and the Brooklyn DA's office, which to their credit, like they actually did. That's, you know, good for you. The FBI had also launched their own investigation into the former partners. At the time, Anthony Casso was in jail on charges from the FBI related to being a boss in the Lucchese crime family. Casso told the feds that he had information about two former NYPD detectives who were passing information to the mafia. He told them Eppolito and Caracappa were his contacts at the NYPD, but the U.S. Attorney's Office had already deemed that Casso was not a reliable witness. So the FBI decided to build their case around corroborating the evidence that Casso provided. That meant they needed Bert Kaplan to help them. He was in jail on a drug conviction and they were able to talk to him. And initially he told them he wasn't interested. He wasn't going to talk to them. He was an old timer. He was like, I'm not going to be a rat. You're not going to get me. But Bert's daughter had recently had a child. And his wife and daughter repeatedly, like over the course of several years, had asked him, do whatever you can to get yourself out of prison. Eventually, he decided he wanted to see his family. He wanted to see his granddaughter. That was really, really important to him. And so he said, fuck my friends. Okay, I'll talk to you guys. At the time, they understood that this was going to make their case, but they didn't even suspect that Kaplan had so much information. Like he had everything Casso mentioned plus way more. It was a joint investigation by the DEA, FBI, and Brooklyn DA's office, and Kaplan was either going to make it or break it. So he told them that the two detectives didn't just give information here or there. No. He said that when called upon, they did the mob's dirty work. He told them that Anthony Casso asked the detectives to pick up Jimmy Heidel, so they staked out his house, and when they found him, they kidnapped him. They put him in the trunk of a car, and they delivered him to Casso, who then tortured and killed him before disposing of his body. Eddie Lino was pulled over by Eppolito and Caracappa. They approached, and Caracappa is the one who shot him several times. And they were paid $30,000 for delivering Heidel, $65,000 for murdering Lino. They also offered to find out more information about Nicky Guido's location for $4,000. So they ran his name, gave Casso the location where they killed an innocent man. You are detectives. When you run the information, more than one is going to show up, you dumb shits. Like, you just give them the first one, you're like, whoop, there you go. Jeez. Kaplan said that the two detectives were involved in as many as 9 murders on behalf of the mafia. With Kaplan's information, the prosecutors set about putting their case together. They wanted to include racketeering. And if you're not sure what racketeering is, Mark has given us a definition here. So nice. It's a type of organized crime in which the perpetrators set up a coercive, fraudulent, extortionary, or otherwise illegal coordinated scheme or operation, quote, a racket, to repeatedly or consistently collect a profit. So, there you have it. Which meant that they had to have a crime take place within the previous 5 years of the charges being brought. And that's where Steve, the accountant, comes in. In the episode of Behind the Badge, his face was blurred, his name was changed. He was an accountant who worked in New Jersey before he ended up moving to Las Vegas. And in 2002, he was accused of embezzling and misappropriating funds, and his office was raided by the FBI. He met with them and they said, listen, we have an organized crime case. We would like for you to work undercover to help us. And then we'll use that to help you in your own case. He called his attorney, who was like, dude, if you do that, you're going to be killed. And he was like, well, I've got to try it. So I'm guessing that means that he was guilty of all the charges that he was accused of, because like his attorney was like, no, they'll kill you. They'll have you killed. Like, this is the mob we're talking about. And he was like, I'm going to take my chances. Like, I don't know. Or he was just so desperate to get out of something that he thought he was going to get convicted for, even if he didn't do it. I don't know. Anyway, he agreed to help the FBI. He had been contacted previously from a friend of John Gotti, who had been telling him that he should work with a friend out in Vegas to raise money for his producing movies based on scripts that he had written. And he agreed to meet the man, and that was, you guessed it, Louis Eppolito. They met a few times, and eventually Eppolito brought Caracappa with him to meet the accountant. Steve said that, and that's the, Steve, quote unquote, the accountant, said that Caracappa was the scariest individual that he had ever met. His eyes were almost black. He said that at one point, Eppolito looked over at a mop bucket and said, Look at that. I had one guy that I thought was a rat, and I took his head, I filled that pail up with acid, and I put his head into that pail until all his skin dissolved from his face. That's disgusting and terrifying. He doesn't specify whether or not this man was alive. I don't know. Ugh. Either way. He learned that the two former detectives had still been taking jobs from the mafia. And he wore a wire every time they met, and after 2 years of weekly dinners, they had enough to bring them down on a money laundering charge. How are these men not checking him for wires every time? Or does the FBI just do such a good job that, like, you're not going to find the wire? I don't know. You'd think they'd fucking check for that. They are police officers. And don't most mafia people check for wires? I don't know. That's what they do in movies. Anyway, at one dinner, Eppolito said he needed money to fund his movies, and Steve asked, do you care where it comes from? You know, it could be from drugs. It could be illegally obtained. You know, like, is that a problem for you? He's like, fuck no, that's not a problem for me. I don't give a shit. Just give me the money. So the FBI then arranged for the money to be wired from a fake company to Eppolito. And within a few days, the money was sent. Eppolito accepted the cash. And with that, they got arrest warrants for both Eppolito and Caracappa. On March 9th, 2005, Steve was asked by the FBI to make a dinner reservation where agents would be there to arrest the former detectives as they entered the restaurant. So he goes to a different restaurant, and around 7:30 p.m., his phone started ringing off the hook from people at the restaurant who knew that he was close with both men, and they were like, hey, your buddies are getting arrested. Like, where are you at? In 2006, they were set to face charges of racketeering, obstruction of justice, extortion, and 8 counts of murder and conspiracy. Bert Kaplan was the star witness. He was described as unshakable on the stand. He was able to easily recall any detail when asked about it. He talked about paying the former detectives. They had a retainer of about $4,000 per month for information. And then when they started to kill for the mob, they were getting $35,000, $40,000, sometimes up to $75,000 at a time. Kaplan talked about a man named Israel Greenwald. So Israel Greenwald was a jeweler who'd become successful at a young age, and he was working as an entrepreneur as well. And in the 80s, the mafia had become involved in a scheme involving untraceable bonds, which were as good as cash once you had them in your hand. So basically, if you deposited it in the bank, it couldn't be traced back to where it came from or anything like that. Israel was given a bond, which he thought was a legit bond, but it turned out to be stolen. So Israel was approached by the FBI. They questioned where the bond came from, and he said, my friend gave it to me. And at that point, the FBI wanted Israel to work with them. And he was completely in over his head. He was really worried about what was happening. So he went to speak with his rabbi about the situation. And he's like, look, I have gotten into this situation. My friend gave me something that I didn't know was stolen. Apparently it was stolen. Now the FBI is knocking on my door. They want to know his name. I don't know what to do. And the rabbi said, you can't fucking tattle on your friend, dude. That's not cool. You need to tell your friend what's going on, okay? Just tell him, hey, you probably didn't know it was stolen, but it's stolen. The FBI's asking, so like, you know, just so you know, that's where it is. They're wanting me to talk with them again. So Israel didn't know that his friend was involved in the mafia. So he warned him, this friend, hey, the FBI is looking into these things. And now he's kind of on to you because they asked where I got the bond and I didn't lie to them. And he ends up on a mafia hit list. So Kaplan testified that Israel was driving to work one morning when the two detectives pulled him over. And they told him that someone was at the station accusing him of a hit and run, so you need to come to the station to clear it up. And so he's like, oh, yes, okay, of course. Like, I definitely didn't do that, but if I need to come to the station, absolutely, you know, I'll do whatever I need to do, officers. So he was brought into a parking garage in Brooklyn where he was murdered by Frank Santoro, Eppolito's cousin. Israel's daughter later said that her father would never have just gotten into somebody's car who he didn't know. So using the two police officers to lure him to his death was the only way he would have gone with them because he's a law-abiding citizen. He's like, oh, well, the cops tell me I have to go somewhere. I'm going to do that. Witness after witness testified to everything that Eppolito and Caracappa did over the years. During the trial, Caracappa went on TV and gave an interview to try to get the public on their side. They each had hired well-known lawyers who were experienced with trying cases involving the mafia, but the evidence against the two men was absolutely ironclad. There was no way to refute it. After 4 weeks and over 50 witnesses, both men were found guilty on every single charge in the indictment after just 10 hours of deliberation. They were sentenced to multiple life terms plus additional years. Caracappa, though, only served 7 years of his sentence because he died of cancer in prison in April of 2017. He wrote a letter to the court in 2016 asking for compassionate release due to his cancer, which was denied. I'm sorry. Can you name one compassionate act that you participated in? I'll wait. You want compassionate release when you didn't even bother to make sure that there was not multiple people with the same name when you gave a hitman somebody's address. Like the hits that you completed aside, which those are obviously fucking heinous and terrible, but you didn't even bother to make sure that the wrong person didn't get murdered. Are you fucking kidding? Now you want compassionate release? No. So he died in prison. Eppolito passed away in November of 2019, and all it said was unspecified causes. I'm not really sure what happened there. Yeah, there's just his cause of death is unknown, all of those things. He was 71 when he passed away, and his autobiography is, Mafia Cop. You could check that out. It's subtitled The Story of an Honest Cop Whose Family Was the Mob. Uh-oh. I mean, you can just put anything in a book, can't you? I would not call him an honest cop. Okay, so I'm reading this article from the Times about his obituary, but apparently his uncle and his cousin died because, so he said his uncle was dubbed Jimmy the Clam. He never even used the F word and knew how to take a subpoena like a gentleman. It doesn't sound great when you say it out loud. But in 1979, he was shot in the head, dying along with Jim, his cousin. So there was Big Jim, Little Jim, I guess. The cousin ran a fake children's charity, which ended up bringing too much attention to himself because he was pictured at a luncheon 6 months before that with Rosalind Carter, the wife of then President Jimmy Carter. And so I guess that was too much attention. And obviously Mrs. Carter did not realize that the charity was fake. And that's what got him killed. I mean, literally, it's like crazy. You just have to be so careful, You can still get Mafia Cop on Amazon. This is a man who turned his back on the mob to become the 11th most decorated New York City cop in history, describes his 20-year career and how he was falsely accused of selling secrets to the mob. Wow. That was something that he bragged about a lot too. His son said was like, I'm the 11th most decorated cop in the NYPD. Well, you guys, there you have it. That is the Eppolito and Caracappa case. Cops Gone Wild or whatever. Cops Gone Mob. I don't know. But definitely, we don't like that. We don't like that. So let me know what your thoughts are. As always, check out our YouTube channel. We are doing some fun videos over there. Check us out on Instagram. Follow us there. Make sure you end up on our email list, which is at killerqueens.link/email. You can sign up there. I obviously need to change the graphic for that because it's an old graphic now that I'm clicking it. But we do send a weekly email out every week, just so you know who the sponsors are that week for the show. A big thanks to our sponsors, as always. Without them, I would have to get a real job. And we also have some fun stuff in there, some 90s throwbacks and, nostalgia and stuff like that. So definitely check it out. And we always let you know what episodes are coming up so that you don't miss them. Check us out on Patreon if you want more episodes. You get 3 episodes a week over there, at least. Sometimes we do little catch-up episodes over there. You can hear a lot more of Nikita over on the Patreon as well. So yeah, check us out, hang out with us, and I will catch you on the next episode. Love you. Bye. If you like this episode, be sure to like this episode and follow the show so that you never miss out on new episodes. Get in on the conversation on Facebook and Instagram. You can find us at Killer Queens Pod, or you can join our Facebook discussion group at Killer Queens Podcast, where we discuss cases covered on the show and all things 90s. If you want to submit a case to be covered on the show, visit killerqueenspodcast.com/case submission and just complete the form. And if we cover the case, we'll give you a shout out on the show. Lilas.